Welcome to the Strategy Skills Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Safarova, and our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. And today we have with us two very special guests back for round two, Elizabeth McBride and Seth Levine. Elizabeth is a journalist, author, consultant in finance, women's rights, and technology. And Seth is a partner at Foundry, a venture capital firm based in Boulder, Colorado, which he co-founded in 2006. Seth, Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us again.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's great to be back.
And you guys are on a very, very busy schedule now promoting the book. Maybe we can start briefly from the event that occurred yesterday and some key things you learned from it that could be relevant to our listeners.
Oh, yeah, that's a pleasure. So we had we've been doing a whole round of podcast interviews and other work with the media to get the word out about Capital Evolution, which is the name of our book. And yesterday we were very lucky to have a launch event at the World Bank. I'm a consultant there, and the World Bank Library had held a launch event, which was also broadcast in a webinar format as well. And I was telling Seth before we jumped on this podcast that there were two really interesting things that happened. One was that after the end of the session, a young woman who had been our IT consultant came up and was sort of taking us on about this question of capitalism versus socialism. And she was saying how much she believes socialism is the right answer for the United States. So it was really interesting to engage with her on that and also to get into some of the definitions of socialism and capitalism. And, you know, it was also very interesting that she was a young woman. And so young as in like late 20s. And we were talking about the fact that so much of this drive towards socialism in the United States seems to be coming from young people who are disillusioned with capitalism because they're having a hard time. And our book is really arguing that you shouldn't don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We're saying capitalism is a flawed system. We need to always be working on making it better. But in fact, it's still the best system that we know. So that's one thing. I don't know, Seth, if you want to jump in, we're having kind of...
the only thing I would add is that I jokingly asked Elizabeth whether her parents paid her rent, and she said yes. I guess it came up in the conversation. Yes. I was at this event, but I was virtual, not there in person. And listen, part of why I think it's relevant, because we were talking about this before we started recording, and Chris said, well, our audience, they believe in capitalism, and Elizabeth then responded, which I think is exactly right, which is partially why we wrote this book. It's really important that we all understand that there are actually a lot of people out there, nearly half of people under 40 now, don't think that capitalism works, and they would rather try something else. I think that's why Mamdani, was elected. The Democratic Socialists of America. It's almost impossible for people of my or our age to even imagine this like 20 years ago. But DSA members have been elected in like huge cities in the U.S., right? Not just now in New York, but also prior to that, San Francisco, Seattle, Minneapolis. Interestingly enough, a couple of those cities have kind of like swung back in the other direction because lo and behold, it turns out socialism doesn't work. And it has literally, and I mean literally, like never in a single instance actually worked. And we were sort of talking about that. And I mean, Chris lived it growing up in a different way than sort of we experience it by studying it and reading about it, Elizabeth and me. But anyway, I just would add that in there because I think that people, it's easy when you're sort of in the business community to think that these are silly fringe ideas, and they are those, but they're also, being considered by quite a few people. And again, this is a young woman who worked at the World Bank, and by all accounts, really believed it. Like, I think it wasn't that she was being insincere. I think she was being quite sincere, and unfortunately, I think in our minds, maybe misguided. I was joking with both Chris and Elizabeth. I have 3 kids, sort of all in that age group of sort of very young adults now. And I gave, of course, a copy of the book. We had a few copies sent to us before they were released. I gave them to each of the kids. And one of my daughters said, well, I don't know that I believe in capitalism. And I I thought, wow, that's interesting coming from our background. And, I tried to remind her that like my grandfather didn't graduate from high school. And here we are, leading this incredibly privileged life for a whole bunch of different reasons. And anyway, encourage her to read the book. So,
yeah. I think it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts about that, Chris, but you're in charge of the podcast, so you'll guide us where you want us to go. But I also think some of it is a question of the language we use, right? I think, and in fact, as I talked to that young woman, we got deeper into it, and we found more room for agreement than disagreement, right? She was saying, but utilities really, that should be managed in a socialist way. And she was saying we need universal health care, which is something Seth and I have long argued for as well. So it's not, these lines aren't as hard edged as we like to think. It's just, I think that area of government control of the economy is incredibly dangerous, right? And so that's where you end up really screwing things up if you embrace that.
Yes.
Elizabeth, tell the second half of that story though that you were telling me telling us because it's so interesting and powerful.
Yeah. Okay, I will, and then So the other thing that happened at this World Bank event is that we started the conversation, and one of the team members at the World Bank who had just joined the bank from Nigeria, obviously people from all over the world work at the bank, he was listening from his home about an hour away from the bank. And when we started the conversation, he was so engaged in the ideas that he jumped in his car and raced to get there so he could meet us in person before we ended the event. And that's, he was so engaged in entrepreneurship and this idea of we need to build things really rapidly in his country, and we need to do that based on capitalist principles. And he had all these practical ideas for how you build a system based on free markets in a very income and resource constrained environment. So it was like this classic example, right, of people who have lived in places where the system is really not working versus people who live here in the United States where it's beginning to, we're questioning whether it works, but there's so much about it that's great. And this dichotomy was striking, right?
And it is also sad to see how so many people don't realize the power of American dream and how beliefs that they may have may be killing it in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you think that people who are embracing socialism are beginning to kill it?
Well, I don't want to accuse anyone of anything. As humans, we always do what we believe is in our best interest. Even a parent who sacrifices everything for their child is doing it because they believe it is in their best interest to help their child. But I think that from my perspective of living in many, many countries, well, not many, but quite a few, and working and studying and seeing different types of systems, I can say that having an opportunity to build your own life that really, yes, it's difficult and there is discrimination. And it's hard, and you have to really basically almost kill yourself working, but at least you have a shot. At least you have a chance. And if you're very persistent and diligent, most likely you will be at least relatively successful in breaking out of whatever orbit you are in. When you, for example, arrive to United States or another country similar to United States. And I think it is such a gift for people to live in a system like that.
Yeah, and I think our book is really about how do we maintain and restore that system here where it's beginning to falter or where it has been faltering. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, my great-grandfather was an Irish coal miner, right? Yeah, so we've all lived parts of this story. And
I think it's important to recognize that as much as we push back against this young woman and others who, maybe have a different worldview, different economic view. One, what you said, I think is absolutely right, Elizabeth. There's probably quite a few commonalities, right? I mean, we saw this most recently with Mamdani going to visit Trump in the Oval Office, and I think everyone expected there to be, fireworks and and whatever, fisticuffs, and it turns out they agreed on at least the sort of the things that led to this moment, right? So there's actually quite a bit of commonality there. Not surprising. I mean, the double-digit percentage of people that voted for Mamdani voted for Trump. They obviously have very different prescriptions for what to do about it, but this idea that people are struggling is something that they at least could share. And I think that, when we talk about this young woman that you met at the World Bank being sincere, I think people are sincerely concerned about sort of the ability to achieve the American dream and the ability to do what we just described, right? Which is in a couple of generations to go from not graduating from high school to being at the sort of top of the finance world or the top of the business and journalism world. Like, I think that is truly under threat. And part of what we talk about in the book is not abandoning capitalism to address it, but to recognize that the type of capitalism that we've been operating for the last, in particular, 50 years hasn't really been serving us as a economy. And that really includes everyone in the economy, right? I mean, I think that obviously there's some people that have done quite well, but the argument that we make is that actually really everyone would do better if everyone did better, right? And some of that's just a stability argument, right? And we're at a moment in time which doesn't feel particularly stable. And stability and rule of law is pretty important for people that, want to innovate and start companies and increase their station in life. And some of it's just a practical reality of having extracted from the middle class, from labor, if you will, for so long that there's not a whole lot more to extract. And so we need to figure out a way to lift them up. Now, our argument is, how do we make more capitalists? We want more people. We want this young woman to have a stake in the market system. And you can sort of understand if people don't have a stake in that system, well, they want to try something else. And a radical thing to try sounds like socialism, even if history says it never works.
As you were promoting the book and speaking about the book, what surprised you about how it has been received so far?
So I think the biggest surprise for me has been that there's this, so we've been talking to people all over, but a lot of people in the media. And today we just had a podcast interview with a lady who runs a podcast for NGOs, for nonprofits and things and organizations. And it is the sense with which they view the business leaders as the enemies. That's what I would say surprised me, right? When Seth and I come forward and say, okay, actually our research uncovered a lot of instances of business leaders acting in community-oriented ways, generally maybe too much, and we can have an argument about where the right accountabilities are in the system. But there are a lot of business leaders who are taking actions that will change the world in ways that probably most people believe in, right? They are changing their investments, for instance, in the case of Larry Fink, to invest more in alternative kinds of energy and away from fossil fuels, for an instance. But what you hear as we've been out talking about the book is this belief that businesses could ever do something good. And that is just I feel like it's a strange kind of construct that's taken hold in our very divisive media and political environment.
And even if you take a business owner who is not actively involved with community, but is generally just a good person, and he has people he hired and provided jobs for years and years and years, this is also a contribution. It is much bigger contribution versus if he was just at home watching TV every day because he had money from his family.
Right. It's not an easy thing to build a business and employ people, right? It's an incredibly hard thing. And in fact, I remember when I was just a young journalist, we had this, it was like deeply ingrained in us as a local business journalist that jobs were really key, right? In every story you would report a new business is opening up, and these were the number of jobs. And that kind of like conversation has entirely gone away. Not entirely, probably. I'm sure there are instances of it, but to a large measure gone away in our conversation.
I also think we've entered this world where like we don't we don't allow for sort of gray area, right? You're either on the right side of some issue or the wrong side, and it's a teeter-totter, and there's no sort of middle area, right? So you're either like actively working for whatever thing we're talking about, or you're definitionally against it. And I think that that's wrong. And in the example you just described is a good one, which is like, there are plenty of people that are living decent lives. Let's say raising their children to have, good moral compasses and to be good people, right? And I think there's lots of room to argue about exactly what that is. And I think it's actually a good thing that there's not one, here's the checklist for being a good person. But there's lots of commonalities, right? I think most people could agree on quite a bit of that. And that's, or operating a business and employing people, and like, hey, that's what I've got capacity to do, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. And I think we sometimes forget, like, not everyone either should be, wants to be, can be, whatever, out in the streets marching mm-hmm. for this thing, or, like radically changing the system or whatever. Like most people just want to live decent lives decently. And I think we've kind of forgotten that. And there is this sort of polarization, black and white thinking. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's a mistake. I actually think it's a little bit of a byproduct of neoliberalism. I think it exists on both the right and the left for sure. But I think neoliberalism in some respects sort of taught us to like think and speak in this black and white manner. And it's invaded our politics. It's invaded everything.
And as you were having these discussions, how much the topic of AI came up?
Of AI, a lot, a lot. People are very worried about it. I think rightly worried about it because they see a big labor market disruption. And of course, we just saw stats today, right, about the number of layoffs being higher this year than any year since the beginning of the pandemic. And we also know how hard it is for young people, new college graduates, to find jobs. So this is very much a reality, and people are very worried about it. We don't have prescriptions for it in the book because, the AI world is changing so fast. But the prescription we do have for it is the same that we suggest for this moment of turmoil, which is to work with people, to form coalitions, to recognize that the economy is undergoing a radical transformation. And then we also, so I think what we didn't write about specifically to say this is the answer to AI, but it is a whole chapter in our book, is the idea that if productivity is going to rise so much that it replaces the need for labor, which is essentially what could happen with AI, then what we really need is a system to distribute the earnings of companies in a way that's not taxes, because we all kind of recognize that's a drag on the economy. And what we've suggested is the ownership economy, different forms of the ownership economy may be a way to cushion the blow, cushion some of the disruption of AI.
Let me add a couple things there. And this is, AI is an area where actually Elizabeth and I have a kind of a nice debate between each other. And I describe myself as a techno-optimist. I'm a technologist. I'm a technology venture capitalist. Like I recognize I have a skewed view and rose-colored glasses when it comes to this sort of stuff. And despite that, I recognize that AI is already being disruptive and will continue to be disruptive. But I would say a couple things. I think it is a mistake to attribute all of the job losses that we see today in the economy to AI. I think we're in the middle of a let's call it a recession. We're probably there or close to there. That's being driven by a bunch of different things, right, including higher prices and caused by tariffs, for example, and some other things. I also think AI has become a little bit of a convenient backstory for companies who want to get rid of some people. And so they say, well, we're gaining efficiency, right? But I think if you really read most of the announcements of at least the larger companies around AI, they're more forward looking, saying, hey, we don't expect to hire as many people because we think we're going to be able to get more productivity out of more people. That's more that than it is necessarily firing people. Now, but that said, established companies in the United States are net job losers. They always have been net job losers. And I think we need to remember that the way you combat job losses in the US is through I'm going to say startups. I don't mean technology startups. I mean new businesses writ large. They have always been somewhere between 100% and 100 and call it 10% of job creation in the United States, businesses in their first and second year of operation. So the solution here is to lean into, I'll say the innovation economy, but I really do mean like all forms of small business, because I think that's how we continue to create robust jobs. And then the last thing I'd say is I think we should differentiate between sort of short-term disruption, which I think is real and significant and not dissimilar to what we saw, let's say in the 90s when we started outsourcing manufacturing and a lot of plants closed. And we did a horrible job of figuring out how to retrain former factory workers. So like let's learn from that. But I would differentiate that from what effect does AI have and increased productivity have sort of across the landscape of our economy. I mean, if you go back 100 years or so, 35% or so of the entire workforce made their living on a farm, right? And now it's like 2%. It's really small. And so we automated farm labor out of existence, which is true, 100% true. And employment is significantly larger and stronger than it was back then. So I'm trying to say these things to sort of, I don't know, backstop my somewhat optimistic view overall, but I'm trying not to sound dismissive about it, because if your job went out of existence because of AI, or your company said, hey, we're going to release 10% of our workforce because we feel like we're being more profitable. Now, part of what they're saying is we don't think we have growth opportunity right now in our economy. And so the real fix for this is actually to grow the overall economy more. But that aside, I'm not trying to dismiss that as like that's a real thing. But I also want to be able to take a step back and say, hey, from a systems level perspective, like, are there examples of this sort of disruption happening and us, sort of growing as an overall economy? Absolutely. And have we done things really poorly in some situations, including in the, sort of urban migration that happened in the, early 1900s as we left the agrarian economy? Like, absolutely. So we should learn from that, from the manufacturing outsourcing that I reference as well.
Could you elaborate on your advice for our listeners in terms of them as individuals being ready for being laid off and how to still be able to be in a position to provide for your family?
Oh boy, that's a good and interesting and hard question. I actually had included it in the list of questions for our World Bank event yesterday, because I think more and more people are going to be called upon to be entrepreneurial with whatever expertise they have. And it's actually a different kind of entrepreneurship than coming up with a startup idea or being an app builder or a tech founder or a young person coming out of school. That's one style of entrepreneurship. There's another style that comes from your skills, right? Where you're a hairdresser or you're an HVAC, which are things that, are coming back into vogue right now for young people. But I think for people our age who have built up an expertise in the information economy and in this sort of like the global cities model that we've been living in for the past couple of decades, it's pretty hard. So the advice I would offer, and I've done it, like I'm a single mom. I've been self-employed since, I don't know when, 20 years or something like that. And I have made it work on my expertise and my skill and talent as a writer. First of all, you have to be really, really scrappy. My friend Elaine Pofelt has a book that's called Street Fighting, I think. You have to be a street fighter as an entrepreneur. If you're going to be this kind of like solo entrepreneur in the expert space trying to make your way. I think some of the areas that are still where it's still possible to make a living in this, much less writing, because that has been overtaken by AI, way less editing. which is one space where information professionals used to be able to be solopreneurs. But now the places are events and teaching and coaching. So they're definitely like the face-to-face, be there with your client, build relationships. I actually know a lot of people here in Washington, D.C. who were laid off, a lot of people who were in the information economy but working for the government, who are now becoming elementary, middle, and high school teachers. And so those are areas that those kind of face-to-face interactions where I think people whose skills are being replaced by AI, that's the direction to go.
And I've watched Elizabeth be incredibly scrappy, resilient, right? Open-minded, right? I mean, I think it takes a certain amount of like being willing to just sort of step back, right? I think what hasn't worked is, and I think this is a little bit of what we did wrong again in sort of past instances where you just sort of, people have the skill set they have and you keep going after the same thing. And I think you need to be willing to be a bit more adaptable, right? And so that might mean experimenting on a couple of things. Again, it's easy to sort of like project this onto Elizabeth because we've been such close friends for over a decade now. And I've watched her go through this, like, how do I adapt to a changing landscape? The last thing I'd say is, I think everyone should lean into AI, right? I think it's a mistake to sort of treat it as the enemy, and it may be to some extent if you've been let go and you believe the reason is because your job's been sort of automated away by AI, but I actually think that so I can understand the sort of reticence to embrace it, but I think that that's a mistake, right? AI is we've just scratched the surface, frankly, on what we do with AI. And I think most people, frankly, don't use AI as much as they say they use AI, right? It's, it's the same as whatever, dieting or running or something like that. Like we say we're doing more than we are. But I think that it's over time will become more and more important. And I think the thing to do is become expert in it. And no different, by the way, than the advice that, when my 21-year-old kids are saying, hey, Dad, what do you think we should be doing, around AI? And they have different majors. One's a studio arts major, one's a environmental sciences major. So they're out, one's out in the field doing stuff. One is doing things very viscerally with her hands. But I still say, I think you guys need to be experts at AI in whatever way it relates to the work that you're doing. And I think that that's important advice for everyone. And one of the things I wish I had more time for was more time to just explore sort of how to use AI in my job. I use it a lot, but I'm always asking people what they're using, what tools they're using, how they're using it more effectively. So not to write for us, right?
Yes. I think we made that very clear.
None of this book was written in any way by AI. We might have had a sentence or two where we asked AI to help us with a sentence we couldn't quite get right.
I didn't have a sentence. Okay.
But none of the book was written by AI. So we've had this sort of joke about it. But using AI for whatever it is, in our case, maybe some research, things like that. I mean, there are great use cases across a lot of jobs, and become expert. So you can bring to your next opportunity, not just yourself, but here's me, and here's like my army of agents that help me do the things that I do, whatever that job is.
And just to build on it quickly, if someone is not sure where to even start, what would you recommend they do in terms of starting to educate themselves?
I would start with AI. I would go to, so I should clarify, we are speaking in early December 2025. Oh. At this moment in time, Gemini is probably the best model. They kind of leapfrog each other. So I'd go to Gemini right now. And I actually would start posing these questions to Gemini, right? It is, maybe it's a little recursive to say that, but it actually is, it's a really good way to start learning AI. Is go to an AI, tool and say, hey, I need to start learning AI. This is what I do. Start talking me through it, and be willing to, I think what people do is they treat AI like a search engine, and it's not a search engine, right? So what the best uses of AI, and this is very different than search, is that you need to give it a bunch of context, right? So you need to teach it about yourself a little bit, maybe upload some projects, spend some time, it's called prompt engineering, but prompting AI with, what you are and what you do and what your background is. And here's my LinkedIn profile and here's this and here's that. And then start asking it questions, and over time it gets to know you more and more. It's a little scary that way, actually. But that's the way to get into it, right? Don't just jump in and treat it like you would Google. Like if you're going to just Google search something, go Google search something. If you want to use Gemini, give it some context.
I was going to add 2 thoughts to that. So I was hanging out with some friends, a couple of weeks ago, and we played this game where we all asked, it was just ChatGPT, but we asked, what's the scariest thing in the world to ChatGPT? And it had a different answer for each one of us because it already knew each of our deepest fears. And it was very interesting to see the differences in the responses. So it's a little creepy that way. Have you done that, Seth? Have you done that, Chris?
I was going to tell the story. I had to get online on an app that I hadn't been on in a while, and it asked me a question, what's my favorite song? And I guessed something, and it wasn't the right song, I guess, that I must have put in, 5 years ago and so I went to ChatGPT as well, because I use Gemini more at the moment, but ChatGPT probably knows more about me. And I asked it, and it said, I don't know what your favorite song is, but here's some guesses based on what I know, which was very funny, right? It was really amusing. And then at the very bottom, it said, if you tell me what it is, I'll remember it. And so it kind of popped into my head after these prompts of other songs. I realized which one it might have been. And so it turned out to be that one. So I immediately went over. It was like, hey, this is my favorite song. Because then the next time that comes up, I'm going to probably forget it in a year. And then I'll go back to ChatGPT and it'll be like, hey, here's your favorite song.
So and now you have to tell us, what is it?
Exactly.
I'm almost maybe it shouldn't be embarrassing. Dead or Alive by Bon Jovi. My first guess was Paradise City by Guns N' Roses, which probably is my favorite song, but in that moment 5 years ago. But now you have to tell me what yours are. So
I have to say you were a boy child in the 80s. That's what I have to say.
Clearly, yes, I was the guy. I grew up as a boy in the 80s.
I want to wrap up with the few minutes we have left talking about what you learned from CEOs you spoke to. And I actually was going to focus a lot on it today, but we had so many other important things to discuss. So the first thing I wanted to ask is, across all your interviews, what did the best, well, all of them were incredible leaders, but what did they consistently see that you think others miss?
That's a really good question. Well, the CEOs we interviewed, now we did skew probably to the CEOs that have stepped forward as leaders as societal leaders, right? They're not shying away from that role. So it's a skewed sample. But I think that what they're embracing that other people may be missing is that businesses do have more responsibility in this moment. And that if you're going to run a successful business, you've got to figure out how to navigate this incredibly difficult political environment. And you have to be prepared for when it can hit you, right? When some of those waves of geopolitical turmoil can hit you, and not shying away from that and being aware of the wider context. I'd say that's what they're doing.
Yeah. And I would say, the other comment out, and again, we were so lucky to interview people like Jamie Dimon and Dan Schulman, who's now the CEO of Verizon, and Lisa Green Hall, who basically invented impact investing, and a whole bunch of other really interesting people. So they've all kind of been successful, and maybe that's why this is such an interesting question, but they were very sort of circumspect about their roles and their jobs, right? I was even Jamie, who's pretty successful, for lack of a better way of saying it, there wasn't a lot of ego there, right? It was a lot of a very sort of thoughtful, circumspect. I really rely on, others and my team. There was a lot of that did not feel like lip service. And I in my day job as a venture capitalist, I've met tens of thousands of CEOs. I've worked directly, on whatever. I've been on 100 boards, let's say, and I've worked directly with several hundred CEOs, like very, very closely. And not all of them are like that, by the way, but the successful ones tend to be much more circumstance. And some of the cues that I would give as examples are, people who use we versus I, right? Plural pronouns versus singular pronouns as a really good tip off. People who tell stories about others as opposed to about themselves, or where their stories are more about other people being the heroes rather than themselves being the hero. Those are some commonalities that I've noticed, both in terms of the people that we interviewed, as well as just sort of other successful CEOs. And I think a lot of it also boils down to sort of being able to successfully put yourself in other people's shoes. Like, I think that it is a mistake. By the way, I think this is true of investors, right? I mean, someone once told me early on, I've been a venture capitalist for 25 years. It's early on in my career, someone said to me, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but like, never forget, you're not the market, right? Like, you're not representative of anything. And I think that, so I'm giving this same advice to VCs as I am sort of describing it as coming from successful CEOs. Like, you need to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes as opposed to think that everyone thinks like you do or should think like you do. And those are some common traits that I think we saw in our interviews, but also that I just see across the hundreds and thousands of CEOs that I work with.
Did they mention anything about what they think about AI?
Well, in my world, everyone has to be talking about how amazing AI is, right? I mean, it's a little bit of the emperor's new clothes. Like, I think there is a wide spectrum around how people are really utilizing AI in their businesses. Most companies now are using AI for co-piloting of some kind, let's say, right? So that's definitely happening. And a lot of AI usage is sort of like, how do we make people slightly more efficient or more effective at their jobs? That's like 95% of the use cases, right? Or people aren't using it much at all. And I'm trying to describe it in a way because I feel like everyone feels like they're behind in AI because everyone's talking about how amazing AI is, but I don't know that most people are really, really, really using it the way that people think that most people are using it. So you're probably, if you're listening to this and you've done anything with AI, you're probably right in the middle of the pack, at least in terms of so you're not behind. And then, we do have some edge case companies where people are really leaning into it in new and unique ways, and where they really have a group of agents, right? They're using agentic AI and they're running sort of in the background. So they set them off on a task and then they go do something else. And so they look more like actual workers than they do sort of like a tool set that is enabling workers. And so I want to differentiate those two things. So, but yeah, everyone is talking about AI. It's just, and that may be a little bit of the product of my world. I mean, my wife is a developer and also owns a bookstore in one of the buildings that she redeveloped. I'm sure she uses AI, and we haven't had a long, deep conversation about it. But like, she's selling books, right? I mean, it's I don't want to extrapolate too much from the tech world. It's not that I don't think Main Street businesses should be using AI. It's just that, their main business is people walk into the bookstore and sell, and they sell books, or in the broader sense, she redevelops buildings and she's working with contractors. Like, yeah, AI is helping on the margin, but it's not like a big part of their business.
I can just add that in the spring, I wrote, I think, about 10 profiles of the disruptors, of the disruptor list that CNBC puts out every year. And that, for me, was a reset to be more positive about AI. It wasn't generative AI, though. Those companies are using AI genuinely, like for breakthroughs in medicine, for breakthroughs in like field harvesting. Like there's this really cool combine that rolls over a field and can identify weeds and kill them with a laser, right? So things like that are really, if you think about it, are like where we should be directing more of our conversation, to that deep, innovative economy. And again, Seth and I are both worried about that in the larger construct of capitalism, right? Because some of our capital flows to those truly, the big innovation companies is getting broken right now because of some of the geopolitical and the political issues in the United States.
And if you look at the people you interviewed just as humans, did you notice anything different about their mindset and the way they view the world?
Everyone we talked to was an optimist. which I think is interesting. Now, again, they've all been successful in one way or the other. Not everyone. And by the way, we interviewed people who were workers. We interviewed people that started and run businesses that no one on this podcast have ever heard of. Like, we wanted to get a lot of different stories. Not all of them ended up showing up in the book. We interviewed probably 100 people. I don't know how many show up in the book, but probably half that or fewer. So a lot of these conversations just informed our thinking. But really across the board, people were really optimistic. And that's kind of my general view on humanity. I mean, I think that people tend to be more optimistic, right? And tend to lean towards positive thinking. And I think that was definitely, from my perspective, reflected in the interviews that we conducted.
I have noticed we interviewed more men than women. Among the women we interviewed and among the women who are pretty high powered in the circle where I inhabit, like Dina, who was moderating our discussion yesterday. I have another friend, Sheila, that I talk to regularly, Lisa, who is in the book. Very interesting. I think women leaders at the moment, of course, have less of a roadmap for how to be in the world. And so they really lean into ideas that are slightly on the alternative side. Like the number of conversations I've had about manifesting, alternative healing, spirituality, right? These are not conversations I tend to have with male CEOs, and I talk to a lot of them too, but in the women's business leadership community, there's a strong kind of emerging idea that is a way to succeed. Tap more deeply into that element of life.
Into your own humanity is what you're saying.
Into your own humanity and into your connections with common humanity. The idea that we're all kind of swimming in the big sea, right? And I do think women, I mean, there are a lot of people who have argued this, right? That when, and there's evidence for it, when communities, nations, large bodies of people are coming into trouble or in a disrupted state, women are more connected to that, right? And more focused on how you restore the balance, how you bring things back into balance. So I hear a lot of that from women business leaders.
Thank you so much for sharing this. Yesterday, I got YouTube had this summary of things I watched over the year, and they said, you're a person who will find calm in every situation and will share it with people.
That is so, Chris, you are a person who brings calm. I can tell from our 2 interviews. I really feel that.
And shares because of the work that you do. Yeah. That's it. YouTube knows you well.
Thank you so much, guys, for being here. I really appreciate it. Still using guys, even though it's no longer appropriate to say, but we are all from the time when it was completely normal. I feel very good when people say guys. So no disrespect here. So where can our listeners learn more about you, buy your book, anything you want to share?
We have a website, which is www.thecapitalevolution.com. And both Seth and I have our own individual websites as well. But the most important thing you can do right now is to buy the book and connect with us by reading the book and by sharing what you think of it on Amazon or in social media.
Yeah, the book's available everywhere at this point. So you can buy it from your local bookstore. You can buy it from Amazon. You can buy it from Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books. We'd love it if you'd leave a review and reach out to us. Let us know what you think. We wrote it and tried to put a bunch of ideas into the public sphere, in part to maybe change a few minds, but also to get a bunch of feedback. And so we really, it's a big undertaking to do a project like this, and we'd love to hear from listeners who turn into readers who have thoughts about what we write.
Thank you again so much for being here. I really enjoyed our discussion today, and it's just a bottomless well of things we could discuss that would just fill in a lot of podcast episodes. So for everyone listening, the name of the book is Capital Evolution, and our guests today have been, if you need a reminder, Elizabeth McBride, who is a journalist, author, and consultant in finance, women's rights, and technology, and Seth Levine, who is a partner at Foundry, a venture capital firm based in Boulder, Colorado, which he co-founded in 2006. And our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. And you can get some gifts from us. You can access episode 1 of how to build a consulting practice. And it's actually a very, very powerful program. And we wanted to share episode 1 with everyone because it can really help you start a business if you want to start one, or to manage a consulting practice if you're managing one, which is common for our listeners. We have many people who are partners at consulting firms, major consulting firms. And you can get it at firmsconsulting.com/build. You can also get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies at firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And you can get McKinsey and BCG winning resume, which is a resume that led to offers from both of those firms at firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'm looking forward to connect with you all next time.